Let's begin our last talk. Please join us in welcoming Gustavo Carlo, Sept Professor of Diversity at the Department of Human Development and Family Science at the University of Missouri, whose talk is titled Prosociality and Culture, Links Between Moral Emotions and Cultural Values.
Well, thank you, Christopher. And thank you everyone for participating in this excellent panel, and actually, I think quite diverse in terms of disciplinary approaches, because it's certainly not the typical sort of panel that I've been used to attending, with the exception of the symposium that I was invited to several years ago by Darcia and Nancy. So I'm going to sort of come at this from a slightly different approach, and I guess on multiple levels. First off, I'm going to shift a little bit and try to bring in the notion of culture and the role of culture in terms of trying to understand moral life, moral emotions, moral life. And I'm going to do so by way of focusing on the construct of cultural values and the links between moral emotions, in particular empathic concern or sympathy, which again we can get into with all kinds of definitional, terminological discussions, and then cultural values in a particular cultural group. I'm going to focus on cultural values, emotions, and prosocial behaviors in U.S. Latino, Latina families and youth. So I want to start out a little bit by defining prosociality and in particular prosocial actions or prosocial behaviors that benefit others. And these are the sort of typical sorts of actions that most people desire to see in others and are sort of highly valued across all cultures and societies: sharing, kindness, comforting, volunteerism. There's sort of, in the psychological literature, there's sort of this distinction that is attempted, at least, to be made between selfishly or selflessly motivated prosocial acts as well as prosocial traits. And of course, in one specific subset of actions, prosocial actions, that is of interest to many scholars across many different disciplines are altruistic actions, which I'm going to define for our purposes as those that are primarily intended to benefit others. They're often costly to the self, and there's usually little or no expectations for any sort of material rewards. Such rewards may result from the action, but those were not really the primary intentions of participating in those actions. Again, that's a whole other big area of discussion about altruism and altruistic. Briefly, I want to summarize a little bit of the research, psychological research, looking at sort of traditional predictors and correlates of prosocial behaviors. Of course, we've been talking about empathy, and in our work, we distinguish empathy from sympathy or empathic concern. Empathy, feeling the same as another, could be a positive or negative sort of emotion, valence, matching of emotions, so to speak. Sympathy or empathic concern really having more to do with feelings of sorrow or concern for someone else. It's an other-oriented sort of process. That's very closely related to perspective taking, which is sort of the cognitive element, understanding their thoughts, feelings, and situations. I think several previous speakers were referring to that important aspect of empathic responding. And then another sort of construct of interest, correlate of prosocial behaviors is moral reasoning, which of course is pretty well known, the sort of traditional Piagetian, Kohlbergian sort of approaches. But in our work, we focus on prosocial moral reasoning, which is really more how people resolve dilemmas surrounding issues of welfare or caring for others. All of these, as I mentioned, there's pretty good substantive evidence that all of these are in general related to prosocial behaviors. There's all kinds of caveats and nuances, and but we don't have time to get into all those things. This is just one example of that sort of demonstrates how some of these traditional constructs of interest are related to one another. This is longitudinal data with adolescents from Spain. And on the left side, you can see perspective taking, which sort of predicts empathic concern. And you can see that the path is pretty strong. It's moderately strong as expected. You can also see where empathic concern is significantly positively related to moral reasoning. And again, in this case, we're talking about prosocial moral reasoning. And that is in alignment with scholars and theorists who argue that, that empathic concern can actually prime or induce higher level moral reasoning in individuals. And actually, there's also arguments that it can work in the other direction as well. Bottom line, I believe, is that you can take from this is that these sort of two character traits or skills sort of go hand in hand as well, especially as kids get older. Of particular interest to our lab is the links to prosocial behaviors. And here we have two distinct forms of prosocial behaviors that we try to assess. One is the altruistic, which, as I defined previously, is engaging in behaviors with little expectation or no expectation for any self-benefit or reward. And we can see that the moral reasoning is positively related to altruistic behaviors, but it's negatively related to public. And public is helping that adolescents do in front of others. It's actually tends to be selfishly motivated. That is, they often help in front of others to gain other people's approval. Not always, but that's what we find in our work. You can also see that there is a direct positive link between empathic concern and altruistic helping. The other interesting sort of findings from this study and that you'll note is that although perspective taking is positively related to altruistic and positively related to moral reasoning, those are not significant paths. And that actually is in line with scholars who have noted that understanding other people's situations and their thoughts and feelings actually doesn't always necessarily result in any higher moral actions or prosocial behaviors. And in fact, people can sometimes use that understanding to manipulate or to harm other people. So those are that's sort of a brief overview of the social cognitive, social emotive sort of traits that are associated with prosocial behaviors. And as I said, I want to move a little bit away from that, or perhaps not even away from it, but really think about how we can integrate culture-related processes into these sort of existing frameworks. So why is this important? Well, first of all, cultural group differences in prosocial behaviors are pretty well documented. And again, I don't have time to go into a lot of details here, but I think some people gave some examples, I think, in the previous talks today. But in general, for example, there's a body of evidence that demonstrates pretty reliably that kids from sort of collectivist-oriented societies, such as from Mexico, are more cooperative. They allocate more resources to others than kids from the US, so white European American kids in the US. But there's other bodies of literature, work from anthropologists and cultural developmental scholars, the Whitings and others, that demonstrate that there are differences in culture group differences in prosocial behaviors. So I think we need to sort of look into these things. Culture group differences in empathy-related responding or moral emotions. Yes, there is some evidence on that, but actually the evidence is not as consistent or as reliable. And so that does raise the possibility that, you know, in addition to empathy-related responding, which might help to account for these culture group differences in prosocial behaviors, there may be other sorts of constructs and dimensions that maybe do a better job or as good of a job of accounting for these culture group differences in prosocial behaviors. So as I mentioned previously, we've turned to this notion of cultural values as a potential explanatory mechanism. What are values? Well, values are interesting in and of themselves because like empathy responding, they have both cognitive and affective sort of elements to it. But in this case, values are really sort of these scripts that are organized around some sort of socially constructed domain. Values are numerous, and there's evidence for its enduring qualities over time. Values can be dissected into either more narrow, specific sorts of values, or we can talk about broader values such as collectivism, individualism. But an important aspect to the notion of values is that these scripts actually may guide and influence how we behave in certain situations. There's also evidence about how values, you know, the extent to which individuals endorse certain values, that can actually also help account for any stability in behavioral tendencies across time. So values themselves are sort of can have this sort of enduring quality to them, then they may also help to explain the enduring behavioral tendencies that are often exhibited by individuals. So let's turn to our the cultural group that we've been focusing on in numerous studies, Latinos. And these are Latinos residing in the US, so I often refer to them as US Latinos. Several scholars have demonstrated in cross-ethnic and cross-cultural studies that many Latino families strongly endorse the notion of familism or familismo. And there's really sort of three dimensions to it. The referent aspect to it, which is the extent to which individuals identify with their family unit. So it's not just a sort of isolated, independent sense of self, but that their sense of self is somehow tied to their family unit. It also entails the obligation to the family, this notion of obligations to fulfill family responsibilities and so forth. And of course, there's the aspect of support from the family and of providing support to the family. There are other sort of Latino values that have been highlighted by cultural scholars, such as respeto, or respect, for elders, for others. They've also been linked to collectivism and communalism, and also religiousness. And, you know, again, there may be others. And one thing that's important to actually acknowledge is that, of course, these are not values that all Latino families strongly endorse. There's within culture group variability on these sorts of things. And of course, these are not unique to Latino families or culture. You know, these are present in many other ethnic, racial, and even, you know, rural societies and so forth. So it's not that these things are unique, but there are studies that demonstrate that many Latino families do endorse these sorts of values. And perhaps most importantly, you see very good variability, which is, from our point of view, statistically a very good thing, because that sort of enhances the likelihood of its usefulness as a predictor. One other important aspect to these sorts of values that I highlight here is that these are values that really foster and encourage this sort of other orientation, this orientation towards the needs of others and understanding others and taking other people's situations into account. Okay, so I'm going to briefly turn to a little bit of the work on the cultural values and prosociality in US Latinos. I want to start out first by establishing showing studies that help to establish that this idea that familism values in particular is related to prosociality. We have found that to be the case in several studies using multiple methodologies, independent samples, you know, so on and so forth, longitudinal. So familism values seems to be positively associated with care-based and other oriented forms of prosocial behaviors. Interestingly, in these studies, we've also contrasted it with other values, such as materialism and personal achievement. I have 5 minutes already, which is also associated with prosocial behaviors, but you can tell that in this case, it's associated with the sort of more selfishly motivated form of prosocial behavior, and it's negatively related to altruistic. Okay, gonna kind of have to run through some of this stuff. I wanted to take a step back and again sort of harp a little bit on the importance and the value, pun intended, I suppose, of looking at cultural values. We know from cultural theories that there are several different aspects that help to distinguish culture groups from one another, including their customs, their physical settings and contexts, as well as their beliefs and values. And values is one of these socially constructed notions that are transmitted from caregivers to their children. And so that's also very useful. And we demonstrated in several studies how, for example, mothers who strongly endorse familism values were more likely to use parenting practices that actually facilitated familism values, such as assigning chores and responsibilities to their kids. And kids who picked up on those parenting practices were also more likely to ultimately adopt familism values, stronger familism values, and that was in turn associated with higher levels of prosocial behaviors. Okay, but we need to talk about that missing link, moral emotions. So in general, we know that I've mentioned that empathic concern is related to moral actions. Cultural values are related to moral actions. Parents socialize their kids to these sorts of cultural values, as well as to socializing them to be empathic, as Darcia's talk did a nice job of demonstrating. So where's the evidence that values can promote a consideration of others' needs and others' emotions? Okay, so I apologize for the weird, sort of obtuse figure here, but bear with me a little bit. This is fresh off the press type stuff. So on the left side of the model, we see maternal support, paternal support, and sibling support, which we could talk about some other time. But we find that all of these sources, family members, seem to promote family respect values. So this is respect towards family members. And then you can see in the middle part how family respect model values is positively 0.25 associated with empathic concern. So there's the link between values, particular cultural value, and empathic concern. And then to the right of the figure, you can see how empathic concern then is associated with pro-social behaviors towards family members, towards friends, as well as towards strangers. I don't have time to go into other sorts of paths that I think are very interesting. Well, I will. I lied. Sorry. I will say one other thing. You can see that family respect values has a direct link to helping family members and friends, but not towards helping strangers. So I think that is a very interesting and unique sort of thing. So let me just bring all this to a conclusion. Cultural values, I think we've demonstrated in several studies, and I don't have time to go into all of them here, obviously, that they actually help to explain culture group differences and individual differences in prosociality. We've demonstrated that these values are passed on from caregivers to their kids. We also are now just beginning to demonstrate the link between values and empathy-related responding, which is all moving us towards this sort of idea that the interplay of cultural values and sympathy may help us make sense of how culture plays a major role in understanding moral life. And ultimately, all of this is to move us towards this larger goal of really acknowledging the diversity of morality across our diverse societies and communities. And that's it.
Thank you. And we have 15 minutes for questions. First question from a keynote. If there is nobody very quickly forthcoming, Darcia, I invite you to offer a response.
Is Darcia there?
Yes.
Oh, there she is.
Yeah, sorry, it's okay. Hi. I'm in multiple places, so thank you, Gus. Very interesting and very helpful, I think, to point out the kind of multi-level influence of values and how they're created. I think our work can map onto yours with this evolved nest, because Latinos touch their kids a lot, right? And I gave a talk at a philosophy conference in Amsterdam a few years ago, and after presenting the nest, evolved nest to them, a German philosopher raised his hand and said, "What are you, a Nazi? I don't have to touch my children." At least that's how I remember it. And later on at a reception, a couple of Latin American scholars came up and said, "Oh, you know why he said that? The Germans don't like to touch their children." So they were appalled that they wouldn't be touching. So you can think about the borders, family separation now, how traumatic it is, right, to families where they spend most of their time touching each other, cuddling and such. So I think it's really an important work you're doing to relate this to pro-social behavior and to relate culture. And I appreciate it very much. So I want to talk more about it, but with you later.
Thank you. I will say that and one thing I really didn't have a lot of time to get into is, which I think really does overlap tremendously with your ideas, Darcia, and your, especially the notion of the nest. You know, these beliefs that caregivers have about how best to raise their children is clearly, I think, part of that nest that you talk about in your work. And I think values or beliefs is sort of a mechanism by which it can really strengthen that the importance that we place on, you know, touching and nurturing and affection with our children. And so when we start to think about those sorts of ways in which people raise their children differently, in some societies where they sort of more isolate their children or separate them physically and emotionally from caregivers, I think that does begin to help to understand and make sense of these sort of down the road sort of differences that we see in moral behaviors across societies. So anyway, I appreciate your comments.
Oh, sorry.
No, if someone else has something to add.
Let me just follow up for a second. Here we go.
Go again.
I wanted to say, what did I want to say? Oh, we have found.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, now we can.
Okay. That we have found that attitudes about the nest matter as much, or sometimes as much as behavior in China and the USA. So they're leading to more moral behaviors. So empathy, self-control, cooperation, and such things in young children. So I think there's a lot of promise here to work on together.
I have a question. I was wondering whether you have evidence about the equality between men and women in Latino societies, groups that you've studied.
I'm sorry, did you
equality between men and women in family structures
right,
in
right.
Latino societies, in groups?
Yeah. Well, this may get a little bit towards your question, I'm not sure, but you can tell me if not. One thing that we have noticed in several studies where we look at parenting of prosocial behaviors in white European American families and compare it to parenting of prosocial behaviors in Latino families, we have noticed that it's interesting, but in general, there's less evidence that shows fathers' parenting as being predictive of children and adolescents' prosocial behaviors in white European American families than in Latino families, which is very interesting because it sort of counters some of the stereotypes that there are about, you know, machismo and masculinity. But it also, I think, sort of speaks perhaps to this broader notion of familism and how even with the father perhaps not being the affectionate provider, the primary affectionate provider, that there is a sort of cultural, perhaps a cultural norm or a broader sort of cultural expectation that accepts fathers as being nurturing, but doing so in a much more indirect manner. And so it's kind of a little bit of a puzzle, but it is evidence that we are now, we have accumulated now in several studies when we look at the predictive effects of fathers versus mothers in Latino versus white European American families.
So you're showing that that fathers are not an equal nurturing provider in Latino families.
Well, we're showing that fathers parenting don't seem to predict prosociality in white European American families, but they actually do predict prosociality in Latino families.
Oh.
Yeah, so it's not directly to your question about how much nurturance they demonstrate, because we don't specifically look at that, although that's certainly something that we could look at to see if perhaps, you know, our stereotypes about Latino fathers are just totally incorrect. But I suspect that it may not have to do with the nurturance or direct nurturance, but rather more the indirect sort of nurturance that happens, that results in many Latino families, because really the family unit, as I sort of demonstrated in that one study, even the siblings seem to be involved in fostering prosociality in kids.
I had a question about familism, and as soon as you said the word, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Edward Banfield's work half a century ago on amoral familism. In his work. That's what I think of when I hear the word.
Okay.
And he focused on the dark side of familism in southern Italy,
Sure.
and the way it feeds into what he saw as the dysfunctionality of the mafia-dominated culture there. And I was wondering if you could bring up that slide towards the end. Was familism, did it have no statistically significant effect on prosocial behavior towards strangers, or did it decrease prosocial behavior towards strangers?
Let's see, let me...
Because his argument was familism decreases prosocial behavior outside a narrowly defined family unit.
Yes.
And while it increases it within it, the increase within isn't worth the price you pay for the decrease without, you see. And I was wondering if you had evidence against that view or in support of that view, or how we work outside the family when we have this culture of familism.
Yeah, excellent question. And actually, I'm not even going to show this slide because I can answer your question much more directly. We from other studies, we actually have demonstrated in several studies that the direct path from familism to altruistic helping is actually negative.
Outside the family.
That's right. So there is a downside to familism, as you suggest, which it seems to be fostering more of the in-group sort of helping.
Right.
However, there's also indirect paths that are positive to altruistic helping that stem from family. So it looks as if the familism values actually facilitate empathic concern or higher level moral reasoning, then that higher level moral reasoning and empathic concern actually predicts helping outside the family.
I see.
So familism by itself actually undermines altruistic helping, but it can indirectly facilitate altruistic helping if and only if it is successful at fostering empathic concern and moral reasoning.
Right.
So again, this speaks to this sort of interplay of emotions and cognitions, and that one without the other. And I'm not a philosopher, but I think that's what Hume was trying to.
Yeah, that's exactly. Well, that whole, the key is to develop those empathetic capacities within something larger than the self, but then you can't stop there. And humans myth in their different ways, both talk about an impartial or a generalized or a general point of view that is the aim of the development of moral sentiments that goes beyond, the self, the old expanding circle. Goes beyond, from the self to the family to the community to the state, but can't stop with patriotism, and it has to keep going. But patriotism is better than familism, and familism is better than selfishness. But you've got to move through all of those. It sounds like that's the kind of dynamic you're describing, where strong familism, they were in favor of strong familism and strong patriotism, but because they saw them as steps on the path to an impartial moral concern.
That's right.
But if you stop there, that's a problem.
Right, that's right. It's all in some of our colleagues use the term circle of moral regard. It's expanding that circle of moral regard. And, it's very interesting because in the past, in the early work on prosocial behaviors, scholars didn't really do a good job of differentiating between different subtypes of prosocial behaviors. And so when we first saw this negative relation between familism and altruistic helping, it really sort of counters some of what we see in textbooks, and where a lot of times in textbooks, collectivist-oriented societies are always presented as being more pro-social, more altruistic, but it's actually a much more complex picture. And that's what I think our research is beginning to demonstrate, is that you really do need to sort of look at these different forms of pro-social behaviors. And certainly some specific cultural values foster some forms of pro-social behaviors, but not others. And the same, by the way, with the role of empathic concern versus moral reasoning. I think in the chapter that I contributed to Anna's, Narvaez's, and Snow's Developing the Virtues book, the title of the chapter was The Power of Benevolence. And it was a little bit of there was actually a part of it where we really tried to critique Jonathan Haidt's approach, his moral intuition approach, and his sort of attempts to sort of minimize the role of moral cognitions, because in the end, really what we find in our work is that each of these sort of constructs are important, but they're important in different ways, depending on, again, the types of pro-social behaviors that we're interested, whether they differ by in-group, out-group, whether they differ by motive, selfishly motivated or selflessly motivated forms of behaviors. And also they differ by situational factors that can actually sometimes overwhelm whatever tendencies, dispositions people may have. When we're talking about adolescence, we obviously a major situational influence is the peer group and norms that might be espoused by the peer group. So.
Great, thank you. Out of respect for our agreed deadline, I'm afraid that we have to end here. And thank you so much to all of you. I'd like to especially thank Professors Nancy Campbell and Brandon Costello-Kuhn, RPI staff and grad student colleagues here, and special thanks to Darcia Narvaez and Michael Slote for their generous and early willingness to help organize this. And thanks to Nancy Snow, Gustavo Carlo, and Michael Fraser for their support and continued assistance. And finally, thanks to all the participants for your presence and contributions to this event. We look forward to engaging with you further about these important topics and looking for to plan another one of these in a year's time. So please join me in thanking.
And our thanks to you, Christopher Caulfield, for making it all possible.
Amen.
Thank you so much.
Christopher, will there be a chance for people to ask follow-up questions somehow?
Yep. So I will put on to the website phipod.com. That's phipod.com. Contact information for all of the speakers, and I will also put on contact information there for the participants who have agreed to make that public, as well as slides from the speakers. And already on that website, phipod.com, you can find papers and website links to the speakers.